The words cut through me like a blade through worn leather. Mom, let's be honest here. You're just another mouth to feed now. My eldest son Daniel stood in my cramped apartment kitchen, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the peeling wallpaper and secondhand furniture that had become my reality. Behind him, my daughter Becca nodded in agreement while checking her designer watch, and my youngest Ryan scrolled through his phone, apparently too busy to even look up during what they'd called a necessary family discussion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter, the same hands that had built Thompson Manufacturing from nothing, now trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. 43 years I'd poured my soul into that business. 43 years of 16-hour days, missed holidays, and choosing work over rest so my children could have better lives than I'd had. And this was how they saw me now that the company was struggling, now that I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment instead of the family home I'd built with their father. What my ungrateful children didn't know, couldn't possibly imagine, was that I held the power to either save or destroy everything they'd taken for granted. Hidden away in a safety deposit box across town were documents that would change everything. Papers that would prove to them exactly what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. The $3.2 million inheritance from my business partner Helen Rodriguez was just the beginning. My name is Margaret Thompson, though everyone who knew me during my working years called me Maggie. At 68, I never imagined I'd be telling this story, but here I am, ready to share what happened when my own flesh and blood decided I was nothing more than a financial burden. It all started on a gray Tuesday morning in March, here in Riverside, Ohio, when the sound of expensive car doors slamming in the parking lot below my apartment window announced the arrival of my 3 children. I'd been living in this modest place for 8 months, ever since they'd convinced me to sell the family home where I'd raised them. "It's too big for you now, Mom," Becca had insisted, her marketing executive training evident in how she'd packaged the suggestion. "Think of all the maintenance costs, the property taxes. You'll be so much more comfortable somewhere smaller." What she really meant was that they wanted me out of the way, no longer a reminder of the family business that was hemorrhaging money under their collective mismanagement. The apartment complex wasn't exactly what you'd call upscale. Riverside Gardens had been built in the 70s and showed every one of its 50 years. The hallways smelled like industrial disinfectant and old carpet, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbor Mrs. Patterson's television every evening, but it was clean, affordable, and close enough to downtown that I could still walk to Mike's place for coffee and check on what remained of my life's work. Thompson Manufacturing sat on 12 acres just outside Riverside's main industrial district. The red brick buildings had weathered decades of Ohio winters, and the parking lot was full of potholes that Robert and I had always promised to fix someday. Someday never came for my husband, who died of a heart attack 5 years ago, leaving me to run the business alone until my children decided they knew better. The company manufactured specialty tools and hardware components, nothing glamorous but steady work that had employed 3 generations of Riverside families. When Robert and I started the business in 1981, we had 6 employees working out of a rented warehouse. By 2020, we employed over 150 people and had contracts with companies across the Midwest. We weren't rich, but we were stable, respected, and deeply rooted in our community. Everything changed when the pandemic hit. Like so many small manufacturers, we struggled with supply chain disruptions, reduced orders, and increased costs. I made the difficult decision to take out loans to keep everyone employed, burning through our savings to ensure no one lost their job. My children, who had all moved away for college and built their own careers, suddenly developed opinions about how the business should be run. Daniel had graduated from Ohio State with a business degree and built a successful real estate development company in Columbus. At 42, he drove a BMW, lived in a house worth more than most people see in a lifetime, and had developed the particular brand of arrogance that comes from making money in good economic time. He'd never worked a day at Thompson Manufacturing, but that didn't stop him from having strong opinions about its future. "Mom, you're thinking too small," he'd told me during one of his infrequent visits. "This property is worth a fortune for development. Tear down these old buildings, put up some mixed-use commercial space, maybe some upscale condos. You could retire comfortably instead of throwing good money after bad, trying to save a dying business. Rebecca, my only daughter, had followed a different path but arrived at the same conclusion. She'd studied marketing at Northwestern and worked for a series of increasingly prestigious firms in Chicago. At 39, she was polished, professional, and completely convinced that her corporate experience translated to understanding our family business. Dad's vision was great for its time, she'd explained to me with the patience one might use with a confused elderly relative. But consumer habits have changed. Manufacturing is moving overseas or to automation. You're fighting a losing battle. Ryan, my youngest at 35, had perhaps hurt me the most with his assessment. He'd become a financial advisor, and in his mind, everything came down to numbers on a spreadsheet. "The math doesn't work, Mom," he'd said flatly during our last family dinner together at the house. "You're burning through capital to maintain jobs that aren't economically viable. From a fiduciary standpoint, you're being irresponsible." None of them understood what Thompson Manufacturing meant to our community. They saw overhead and aging equipment, where I saw the Kowalski family, who'd worked for us for 25 years. They saw inefficiency where I saw Maria Santos, whose job on our assembly line had helped her put 3 kids through college. They looked at our older workers and saw expensive healthcare costs. I saw loyalty and expertise that couldn't be replaced. The final straw came 6 months ago, when they staged what I now recognize as a coordinated intervention. All 3 arrived at the house on the same evening, armed with spreadsheets, market analyses, and a lawyer I'd never met. They presented me with papers to sell the business and the property, assuring me it was the smart move and that they'd take care of everything. When I refused, their patience evaporated. The mask of filial concern slipped, and I saw them clearly for perhaps the first time. Daniel became openly hostile, demanding to know why I was being so stubborn about a failing business. Becca switched to her professional voice, explaining the realities of the marketplace, as if I were a client who needed education rather than her mother. Ryan simply pulled out his phone and started calculating how much money I was costing them by refusing to be reasonable. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of fighting them directly, instead of pleading for their understanding or respect, I smiled and told them I needed time to think. They left that night believing they'd worn me down, that it was only a matter of time before I'd sign their papers and accept their vision of my future. What they didn't know was that Helen Rodriguez, my business partner and closest friend for over 30 years, had died 3 months earlier and left me everything. Helen had never married, never had children, and had poured her considerable intelligence and energy into expanding Thompson Manufacturing's reach. While I'd focused on operations and employee relations, Helen had quietly built a network of investments, secured patents on several of our innovations, and accumulated a fortune that would have shocked my children. Helen's lawyer had contacted me just after the funeral, but I'd been too overwhelmed with grief and business pressures to fully process what he was telling me. It wasn't until my children's intervention that I drove to his office and learned the full scope of what Helen had left me. $3.2 million in various accounts, plus ownership stakes in 2 other manufacturing companies, plus the patents that I'd helped her develop over the years. The money wasn't the most important part, though it certainly opened possibilities I'd never considered. The real gift Helen had given me was choice. For the first time in months, I didn't have to accept my children's version of reality. I didn't have to sell the business, abandon my employees, or fade quietly into the background of their successful lives. I spent the next week walking through Thompson Manufacturing, really looking at what we'd built. The machine shop where Carlos had worked for 15 years, teaching younger employees the precision required for our specialty component. The assembly area where teams of workers took pride in products that bore our name. The small office where Helen and I had spent countless hours planning, dreaming, and building something that mattered. The business was struggling, that much was true. We'd accumulated debt during the pandemic, and several of our largest contracts had ended when companies moved production overseas. But the problems weren't insurmountable, especially with Helen's inheritance providing the capital for modernization and debt relief. What we needed wasn't a funeral. We needed a resurrection. That's when I started planning, not just to save the business, but to teach my children a lesson they'd never forget. They'd dismissed me as irrelevant, seen me as nothing more than an expense to be managed. They were about to learn exactly how much power this mouth to feed actually possessed. I started by meeting quietly with our employees, the people whose livelihoods my children were so eager to sacrifice. I didn't reveal my plans, but I listened to their concerns, their ideas for improvement, and their hopes for the future. What I heard broke my heart and strengthened my resolve in equal measure. Tom Wilson, our head of quality control, had been with us since the early days. At 58, he was too old to easily find another job but too young to retire. "Mrs. Thompson," he told me during one of our conversations, "I know things are tough, but this place is like family to me. If there's anything we can do to turn things around, you just say the word." Maria Santos echoed his sentiment. She'd started as a temporary worker during busy seasons and worked her way up to line supervisor. "My kids went to college because of the steady work here," she said. "Now my youngest is graduating from nursing school. If I could do anything to help save this place, I would." These conversations reminded me why Helen and I had built Thompson Manufacturing in the first place. It wasn't just about profit or return on investment. It was about creating something meaningful, something that contributed to our community and provided dignity through good work. Meanwhile, my children continued their campaign to convince me to sell. They alternated between condescension and frustration, unable to understand why I wouldn't simply accept their superior wisdom. Daniel sent me articles about successful business exits and retirement planning. Becca forwarded market research about commercial development in mid-sized Ohio City. Ryan created detailed financial projections, showing how much money I was losing every month by keeping the business open. None of them bothered to ask what I wanted or what the business meant to me. They'd decided what was best and were simply waiting for me to acknowledge their obvious correctness. Their impatience grew as weeks passed without my capitulation, and their true feelings about my intelligence and capabilities became increasingly clear. The breaking point came on that March morning, when they'd driven down from their successful lives to stage another intervention. This time, they hadn't bothered with pretense or politeness. They arrived at my apartment with ultimatums and barely concealed contempt. "Mom, you're being ridiculous," Becca had started, her designer heels clicking on my linoleum floor. "We've been patient, but this has gone on long enough. You're hemorrhaging money on a business that can't be saved." Daniel had been more direct. "Look around, Mom. You're living in a place that's barely better than subsidized housing, because you won't make the smart choice. How much more of your dignity are you willing to sacrifice for a company that should have been shut down years ago?" But it was Ryan's comment that revealed how they really saw me. As we sat around my small kitchen table, surrounded by the modest furniture I'd bought after selling the family home, he'd looked at me with the cold calculation of someone evaluating a bad investment. "Mom, let's be honest here. You're just another mouth to feed now. The business is dying. You're living on whatever savings you have left, and you're going to expect us to support you when the money runs out. The responsible thing is to sell while you can still get something for the property." The silence that followed was profound. I looked at each of my children, these people I'd sacrificed everything for, and saw them clearly for the first time. They weren't concerned about my welfare or my happiness. They were protecting themselves from the inconvenience of having a mother who might need their help. "I see," I said quietly, standing up from the table. "Thank you for making your position so clear." They left shortly after, satisfied that they'd finally gotten through to me. Daniel promised to have his lawyer prepare the paperwork. Becca offered to help me transition to a more sustainable living situation. Ryan suggested financial planning services to help me maximize the proceeds from the sale. None of them bothered to ask how I felt about their assessment or whether I had any other option. They'd spoken, and that should be the end of it. What happened next would haunt their comfortable assumptions forever. As their expensive cars pulled out of my apartment complex parking lot, I walked to my bedroom and pulled out the folder Helen's lawyer had given me. Inside were bank statements, investment portfolios, and ownership documents that represented more than just money. They represented possibility, justice, and the power to rewrite the story my children thought they were ending. I had a choice to make. I could use Helen's gift to quietly save Thompson Manufacturing, prove my children wrong, and hope they'd eventually understand their mistake. Or I could do something more dramatic, something that would force them to confront the consequences of their arrogance and disrespect. I chose the path that would teach them never to underestimate their mother again. The first step was strategic. Instead of revealing my new resources, I would let my children believe they were winners. I called Daniel the next day and told him I was ready to consider their proposal, but I needed time to wrap my head around it. I asked for 60 days to get my affairs in order before we moved forward with the sale. They were thrilled by what they saw as my capitulation. Daniel immediately started planning his development project. Becca began researching age-appropriate housing options for me. Ryan sent me brochures for financial advisors who specialized in retirement transitions. During those 60 days, I was busier than I'd been in years. Working with Helen's lawyer and a team of financial advisors she'd recommended, I quietly restructured Thompson Manufacturing's debt, updated our equipment, and began implementing changes that would position us for growth rather than just survival. The first surprise came when I bought out our largest creditor and renegotiated payment terms with suppliers. Suddenly, the financial pressure that had been crushing us for 2 years was manageable. Cash flow improved, and for the first time in months, I could see a path forward. The second phase involved our employees. I called a series of meetings to discuss modernization plans, efficiency improvements, and profit-sharing arrangements that would give everyone a stake in our success. The response was overwhelming. Workers who'd been worried about their jobs became partners in our revival. Tom Wilson suggested equipment upgrades that would reduce waste and improve quality. Maria Santos proposed cross-training programs that would make our workforce more flexible and valuable. Even our newest employees contributed ideas for cost savings and process improvements. As Thompson Manufacturing began its quiet transformation, my children remained oblivious. They were too busy planning my future to notice that I was actively creating it myself. Their calls became increasingly impatient as the 60-day deadline approached, but I assured them I was making progress on accepting reality. The reality I was accepting, however, was very different from what they imagined. I was accepting that my children had revealed their true character, and I was accepting the responsibility to respond appropriately. Helen's inheritance had given me the means, their behavior had given me the motivation. 2 weeks before their deadline, I made the final arrangement. James Parker, Helen's lawyer, prepared a series of documents that would formalize the new structure of Thompson Manufacturing. The company would emerge from its financial difficulties stronger and more independent than ever, with ownership arrangements that would ensure its future stability. The stage was set for a confrontation that would forever change the dynamics of our family. My children thought they were coming to collect their victory. Instead, they were about to discover that the mother they'd dismissed as irrelevant held more power than they'd ever imagined. The 60 days were almost up, and it was time to show them exactly what happens when you mistake a strategic retreat for defeat. They'd told me I was just another mouth to feed. I was about to feed them something they'd never forget. The morning of the 60th day arrived with the kind of crisp April weather that made Riverside feel like a place where good things were possible. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to important business meetings back when my children still respected my opinion. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was preparing for the most important negotiation of my life in an apartment they'd convinced me to move to for my own good.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Daniel had called the night before to confirm our meeting at Thompson Manufacturing's main office. "I hope you're finally ready to be reasonable, Mom," he'd said, his voice carrying that particular blend of impatience and condescension I'd grown to despise. "My development team is eager to get started on the property assessment." What Daniel didn't know was that his development team would be assessing property they'd never own. What none of my children knew was that Thompson Manufacturing had spent the past 2 months transforming itself from a struggling family business into something entirely different. The financial restructuring was complete, the equipment upgrades were installed, and our workforce had embraced changes that would have seemed impossible when they'd first presented me with their ultimatum. I arrived at the factory 45 minutes early, wanting time to walk through the building one more time before the confrontation that would change everything. The morning shift was already in full swing, and the differences from 2 months ago were remarkable. New machinery hummed efficiently in the main production area, operated by workers whose confidence had returned along with job security. The air no longer carried the tension of impending doom that had hung over us for so long. Maria Santos spotted me first and approached with a smile I hadn't seen on her face in over a year. "Mrs. Thompson, everything's ready for the big meeting today. The whole crew knows something important is happening." She paused, studying my expression. "You sure you're doing the right thing with your kids?" I patted her shoulder gently. "Maria, sometimes the people we love most need to learn the hardest lessons. Today, my children are going to discover that their mother isn't quite as helpless as they assume." Tom Wilson emerged from the quality control department, carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of satisfied expression that comes from solving complicated problems. "Maggie, I've got the latest production reports if you need them for your meeting. Everything's running better than it has in 3 years." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Whatever you're planning, the whole factory is behind you." The loyalty of these people, their faith in me and in Thompson Manufacturing, only strengthened my resolve. My children had been willing to destroy all of this, to put 150 families out of work, simply because it was more convenient than trying to understand what we'd built here. They were about to learn that convenience comes at a price. James Parker arrived at 9:30, carrying a briefcase full of documents that would serve as ammunition in the battle ahead. Helen's lawyer had become more than just a legal advisor over the past 2 months. He'd become a strategic partner in what he'd come to call the most satisfying case of corporate justice he'd ever handled. "Margaret, are you absolutely certain you want to proceed this way?" he asked as we settled into the conference room that overlooked the factory floor. "Once we reveal the extent of the restructuring, there's no going back to the previous family dynamic." I looked out at the workers below, people who'd trusted me to find a way forward when everything seemed hopeless. "James, my children made their choice when they decided I was just a burden to be managed. Today they learn what happens when you underestimate someone who's been building businesses since before you were born." At exactly 10 o'clock, I heard the sound of expensive cars pulling into our visitor parking area. Through the conference room window, I watched my 3 children emerge from their vehicles, each carrying the particular brand of arrogance that comes from believing you're about to win a long-fought battle. Daniel wore his most expensive suit and carried a briefcase that probably cost more than most of our workers made in a month. Becca had dressed for what she clearly saw as a business victory, her designer outfit carefully chosen to project success and authority. Ryan checked his phone obsessively, already calculating the profit margins from the property sale that would never happen. They entered the building through the main office, and I could hear their voices carrying down the hallway as they discussed logistics with the casual confidence of people who'd never doubted the outcome. "I've already got 3 contractors lined up for the demolition," Daniel was. "We can have this place cleared and ready for development within 6 months. The marketing potential is fantastic," Becca added. "Revitalizing industrial areas is huge right now. We could position this as bringing modern amenities to a traditional working-class community." Ryan's contribution was purely financial. "Based on current property values and development costs, we're looking at a minimum 20% return on investment, possibly higher if we can get the right zoning variances." They walked into the conference room like conquering generals, barely acknowledging my presence as they arranged their materials on the table. The disrespect was so casual, so complete, that I almost felt sorry for what was about to happen to them. "Mom, I'm glad you've finally decided to be realistic about this situation," Daniel began, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "I've brought the purchase agreements, and my lawyer has structured everything to minimize your tax burden from the sale." Becca spread out what appeared to be architectural renderings and marketing materials. "I've also prepared some preliminary concepts for what we could do with this property. Mixed-use development, some retail space, maybe upscale condominiums for young professionals who want to live close to downtown Riverside." Ryan, meanwhile, had opened his laptop and was projecting financial spreadsheets onto the wall. "Here's the breakdown of expected proceeds from the sale, along with investment recommendations for your retirement planning. If we move quickly, you could be financially secure for the rest of your life." I sat quietly through their presentations, maintaining the same patient expression I'd perfected over decades of business negotiations. When they finished, the silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. "That's very thorough," I said finally. You've clearly put a lot of thought into spending my money and disposing of my life's work. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Mom, we've been over this. The business isn't viable anymore. Holding on to it is just throwing good money after bad. I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the factory floor. Tell me, Daniel, when was the last time you actually looked at our production numbers? Mom, the numbers don't lie, Ryan interjected, his fingers flying over his laptop keyboard. Your debt-to-revenue ratio is completely unsustainable. Your equipment is outdated, and your labor costs are way above industry standards. I turned back to face them, and for the first time since they'd entered the room, I smiled. Ryan, you're absolutely right. Those numbers don't lie. But perhaps you should look at more recent numbers. James Parker chose that moment to enter the conference room, carrying a briefcase that my children eyed with sudden wariness. Good morning, everyone. Margaret, shall we begin? Daniel looked between James and me with growing confusion. Mom, who is this? We already have legal representation for the sale. Children, I said, settling back into my chair with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. I'd like you to meet James Parker, attorney for the Helen Rodriguez estate, and as of 60 days ago, general counsel for Thompson Manufacturing. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and profound. Becca stopped shuffling her marketing materials. Ryan's fingers froze over his keyboard. Daniel's expensive briefcase suddenly seemed less impressive than it had moments before. I don't understand, Becca said slowly. What does Helen's estate have to do with our family business? James opened his briefcase with deliberate precision. Miss Thompson, your mother's business partner left her a considerable inheritance. As of 8 weeks ago, Thompson Manufacturing's financial situation has changed dramatically. I watched my children's faces as James spread out documents across the conference table, bank statements showing millions in assets, investment portfolios worth more than they'd ever imagined, legal papers establishing the new corporate structure of Thompson Manufacturing. This is impossible, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. You told us you were broke. You said the business was failing. No, I corrected gently. You told me the business was failing. You told me I was incompetent. You told me I was just another mouth to feed. I never agreed with any of those assessments. Ryan was staring at the financial documents with the expression of someone watching his carefully constructed world collapse. $3.2 million, he read aloud, plus investment accounts, plus patent holdings, plus the complete financial restructuring of Thompson Manufacturing, James continued smoothly. All debts have been satisfied, equipment has been upgraded, and the company is now positioned for substantial growth over the next 5 years. Becca found her voice first, though it came out as more of a croak. You've had this money for 2 months, while we've been trying to help you face reality. Reality, I repeated thoughtfully. Yes, let's talk about reality. The reality is that, while you 3 were planning to destroy my life's work and put 150 people out of jobs, I was actually solving the problems you were too arrogant to believe could be solved. Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is insane, Mom. You let us believe you were in financial trouble. You let us worry about your future. Did I? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a recording app. Daniel, would you like me to play back your exact words from our last family meeting? The part where you told me I was living in barely subsidized housing, or perhaps Ryan's observation that I was just another mouth to feed. The color drained from Ryan's face. Mom, that's not what I meant. I was talking about the business being a financial drain. No, son, you were talking about me being a financial drain. There's a difference, and we all heard it. James had continued arranging documents while we talked, and now the full scope of Thompson Manufacturing's transformation was laid out before us. Production reports showing increased efficiency, employee satisfaction surveys indicating record-high morale, contract agreements with new clients worth more than we'd earned in the previous 2 years combined. How is this possible? Becca whispered, studying the papers with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years analyzing business performance. It's possible, I said, because while you were planning my retirement, I was planning my resurrection. Helen left me more than money, children. She left me the tools to prove that written off doesn't mean worthless. Tom Wilson chose that moment to knock on the conference room door. Mrs. Thompson, sorry to interrupt, but we just got confirmation on the Johnson Industries contract. They want to double their order for next quarter. I smiled at Tom, then turned back to my children. Tom, would you mind sharing our latest production numbers with my family? Tom's grin was infectious as he pulled out his tablet. Sure thing, we're running at 94% efficiency, up from 67%. Quality control rejections are down to less than 2%, and our delivery times have improved by 40% since we installed the new equipment. Daniel was staring at Tom as if he'd never seen him before. New equipment? What new equipment? State-of-the-art CNC machines, updated assembly systems, computerized inventory management, Tom rattled off proudly. Mrs. Thompson spared no expense in bringing us into the 21st century. After Tom left, the silence in the conference room was deafening. My children sat surrounded by the evidence of everything they'd gotten wrong, everything they'd failed to understand about their mother and the business she'd built. I need some air, Daniel said suddenly, loosening his tie. This is a lot to process. Take all the time you need, I replied pleasantly, but while you're processing, let me share one more piece of reality with you. I nodded to James, who pulled out a final set of documents. Thompson Manufacturing is no longer a family business in the traditional sense. It's now structured as an employee-owned cooperative, with profit-sharing arrangements for all workers and a board of directors elected by the workforce. Ryan's laptop screen had gone to sleep, but he was staring at it as if it might provide answers to questions he hadn't known to ask. Employee-owned? What does that mean for us? It means, I said carefully, that the people who actually build our products now have a voice in how the company is run. It means that decisions will be made by those who understand the work, not by those who see workers as line items on a balance sheet. Becca had been uncharacteristically quiet, but now she spoke up with something approaching respect in her voice. Mom, this is actually brilliant from a business standpoint. Employee ownership typically increases productivity and reduces turnover. Thank you, dear. I'm glad you approve. Daniel, however, was less impressed with my strategic planning. Okay, fine. You've saved the business. You've proven that we were wrong about the finances. But what was the point of letting us believe you were helpless? Why put us through 2 months of thinking you were being stubborn and unrealistic? I stood and walked to the whiteboard where James had written the key figures from our transformation. Daniel, do you remember what you told me about this place? About how I was throwing good money after bad? Yes, but that was before we knew about Helen's inheritance. I turned to face him directly. Tell me, in all your real estate development experience, have you ever taken the time to understand a business before deciding it was worthless? Daniel's silence was answer enough. Becca, with all your marketing expertise, did you ever ask what our customers valued about Thompson Manufacturing before deciding we should be replaced with condominiums? Becca looked down at her expensive shoes. Ryan, with all your financial planning knowledge, did you ever examine what Helen and I had built here before calculating that it wasn't worth saving? Ryan closed his laptop with a soft click. You see, children, the problem was never that Thompson Manufacturing couldn't be saved. The problem was that you'd already decided it wasn't worth saving. More importantly, you'd decided that I wasn't capable of saving it. James had been organizing his papers while we talked, but now he looked up with the satisfied expression of a lawyer who'd just won a particularly challenging case. Margaret, should I explain the new ownership structure in more detail? I considered this. My children were still processing the revelation that their helpless mother had just pulled off one of the most dramatic corporate turnarounds in Riverside's history. Perhaps it was time for the final surprise. Actually, James, I think there's one more thing they need to understand. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I'd been saving for this exact moment. Children, Helen left me something else besides money and business opportunities. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Margaret, how did the big reveal go? I put the call on speaker. Patricia Hoffman, I'd like you to meet my children. Dr. Hoffman is a business psychologist who specializes in family dynamics within closely held companies. Daniel, Becca and Ryan stared at the phone as if it might explode. Hello, Thompson family. Dr. Hoffman's warm voice filled the conference room. Your mother has told me so much about you all. I understand today has been quite an eye-opening experience. Dr. Hoffman, I continued, has been helping me understand some things about our family dynamic. Helen actually recommended her before she died, after watching how my children had begun treating me. Becca found her voice first. Mom, what kind of things? Dr. Hoffman's answer was gentle but direct. Well, your mother has been exploring patterns of dismissive behavior, particularly how successful adult children sometimes begin to see their aging parents as burdens rather than resources. It's surprisingly common in families where the children have achieved significant professional success. The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of the factory floor below us. The interesting thing, Dr. Hoffman continued, is that these patterns often reverse dramatically when the parent demonstrates continued competence and independence. Margaret's restructuring of Thompson Manufacturing wasn't just about saving a business. It was about reclaiming her identity as a capable, intelligent woman who deserved respect from her own children. Daniel was the first to speak, and his voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. Dr. Hoffman, are you saying we've been treating our mother badly? I'm saying that families often develop unhealthy patterns without realizing it. The important thing is recognizing those patterns and working to change them. After we ended the call with Dr. Hoffman, my children sat in stunned silence. The conference table was covered with evidence of their complete misunderstanding of their mother's capabilities, their dismissive attitude toward a business they'd never bothered to understand, and their casual willingness to destroy something that employed half their hometown. I think, I said quietly, it's time for some honest conversation about where we go from here. Ryan opened his laptop again, but this time he wasn't calculating profit margin. He was staring at a blank document, as if trying to figure out how to begin writing a completely different story than the one he'd planned. Mom, he said finally, I owe you an apology. We all do. But I need to understand something. If you could save the business all along, why didn't you just tell us? Why go through this elaborate demonstration? I sat back down, feeling every one of my 68 years but also feeling more energetic than I had in months. Ryan, if I'd simply announced that Helen had left me money and that I was restructuring the business, what would you have done? He thought about this. Probably tried to talk you out of it. Maybe suggested better investment strategies. Exactly. You would have found new ways to dismiss my judgment and override my decisions. You'd already decided I was incompetent, so evidence of competence would just be something else to manage. Becca was nodding slowly. You needed us to see the results, not just the plan. More than that, I said, I needed you to see the cost of your assumptions. Thompson Manufacturing isn't just my business. It's Maria's livelihood, Tom's career, and the economic foundation for dozens of families in this community. When you decided it was worthless, you were deciding that all of those people were disposable. Daniel had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now he spoke up with something approaching humility. Mom, I've built my career on identifying undervalued properties and maximizing their development potential. But I never even looked at Thompson Manufacturing as a business. I just saw real estate. And I saw a dying industry that didn't fit modern market realities. Becca added, I never considered that maybe the industry wasn't dying, maybe it just needed better management and investment. Ryan closed his laptop entirely. I saw numbers that didn't make sense, so I assumed the business was the problem. I never considered that maybe we just needed better numbers. Or, I suggested gently, maybe you could have trusted that your mother might know something about running the business she'd built from nothing. The afternoon sun was streaming through the conference room windows now, illuminating the scattered papers that told the story of Thompson Manufacturing's remarkable transformation. In a few hours, the day shift would end, and the evening shift would begin, continuing the work that my children had been so eager to eliminate. James Parker had been quietly observing our family reconciliation, and now he spoke up with a question that cut to the heart of everything we'd been discussing. Margaret, what do you want to happen next? It was the question I'd been asking myself for 2 months, and finally, I had an answer. I want my children to understand that competence doesn't diminish with age. that wisdom comes from experience, and that family businesses can thrive when everyone contributes their strengths, instead of fighting over control. I paused, looking at each of my children in turn. But most importantly, I want them to understand that treating someone like a burden creates distance, while treating them like a resource creates partnership. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had filled the room earlier. This was contemplative silence, the kind that comes when people are genuinely considering new possibilities. "What can we do to help?" Becca asked finally, and for the first time in months, when one of my children asked that question, I believed they actually wanted to hear the answer. The question hung in the air between us like a bridge waiting to be crossed. For the first time in over 2 years, one of my children had asked how they could help instead of telling me what I should do. The shift was so profound that I found myself momentarily speechless. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I had so many answers I didn't know where to begin. James Parker must have sensed the emotional weight of the moment, because he quietly gathered his papers and excused himself from the conference room. "Margaret, I'll be in the main office if you need anything. Take all the time you want." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving just the four of us surrounded by the evidence of everything that had changed. I walked back to the window overlooking the factory floor, where the afternoon shift was hitting their stride. The new machinery hummed with efficiency, operated by workers whose faces no longer carried the strain of uncertainty. "Becca, you asked what you could do to help. Let me start by telling you what I don't need." She straightened in her chair, her marketing executive training kicking in as she prepared to receive feedback. "I don't need you to manage me, protect me from my own decisions, or assume that your success in Chicago translates to understanding Thompson Manufacturing. What I do need is for you to respect that I've been building businesses since before you were born, and that experience might actually be valuable." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his expensive suit. "Mom, we thought we were protecting you from making a costly mistake." "No, Daniel, you thought you were protecting yourselves from having to deal with the consequences of my mistake. There's a difference." I turned back to face them, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was talking to my children rather than defending myself against critics. But that's in the past. The question now is whether you want to be part of building something together or whether you prefer to remain observers critiquing from a distance. Ryan had reopened his laptop, but instead of pulling up financial projections, he was taking note. The transformation from dismissive analyst to engaged family member was remarkable to witness. "Mom, I need to understand the employee ownership structure you've created. From a financial planning perspective, it's actually brilliant, but I want to make sure I'm grasping all the implications." For the next hour, I walked them through every aspect of Thompson Manufacturing's resurrection. The debt restructuring that had eliminated our crushing monthly obligations, the equipment upgrades that had tripled our efficiency while reducing waste, the profit-sharing system that had transformed our workforce from worried employees into invested partners. Most importantly, the cultural changes that had restored pride in craftsmanship and commitment to quality. "The numbers are incredible," Ryan said, scrolling through production reports on his laptop. "You've essentially rebuilt the company from the inside out." "Not me," I corrected. "We." Tom Wilson identified the equipment needs. Maria Santos designed the cross-training program. Carlos Rodriguez suggested the waste reduction protocols. I provided the capital and the vision, but the solutions came from people who understood the work. Becca was studying the employee satisfaction surveys with the focused attention she usually reserved for major marketing campaigns. "Mom, these engagement scores are off the charts. How did you convince people to embrace so much change so quickly?" "I didn't convince them. I listened to them. For 3 years our workers had been watching the business struggle and coming up with ideas to fix things. Management just hadn't been asking for their input." I paused, letting that sink in. Sound familiar? The parallel wasn't lost on any of them. They'd spent 2 years telling me what was wrong without ever asking what I thought might be right. Daniel had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up with a question that surprised me. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Are you doing all this to punish us?" I considered his question carefully. The old Margaret, the one who'd been dismissed and discounted, might have been motivated by revenge, but the woman I'd become through this process had discovered something more powerful than punishment. Daniel, do you remember when you were 12 and decided you wanted to build a treehouse in the oak tree behind our house? He nodded, clearly wondering where this was going. You spent weeks drawing plans, measuring lumber and calculating what materials you'd need. Your father and I watched you work, and we were so proud of your initiative and planning. I remember, you let me use Dad's tools and bought all the supplies. Do you remember what happened when you tried to build it? Daniel's expression shifted as the memory returned. Everything went wrong. The measurements were off, the lumber was too heavy for me to lift alone, and I couldn't figure out how to make the joints stable. And what did we do? You and Dad came out and helped me, but you didn't take over the project. You showed me techniques, held things while I worked, and helped me solve problems without making me feel stupid. Exactly. We didn't tell you the treehouse was a bad idea or that you weren't capable of building it. We helped you learn skills you needed, and provided support when the work got difficult. Ryan looked up from his laptop. Are you saying we should have offered to help instead of telling you to quit? I'm saying that when someone you love is struggling with something important to them, your first instinct should be to ask how you can support their success, not to convince them to give up. The afternoon was wearing on, and I could see my children processing not just the business transformation, but the deeper family dynamics that had led us to this point. James Parker returned with coffee and sandwiches from Mike's place, giving us fuel for what I suspected would be a long conversation. Mrs. Thompson, he said as he set down the food, the Johnson Industries representative called. They want to schedule a tour of the facility next week to discuss expanding their contract. After James left again, Becca picked up her sandwich but didn't eat it. Instead, she stared out the window at the parking lot where their expensive cars sat next to the pickup trucks and economy cars driven by our workers. Mom, I need to tell you something that's been bothering me for months. Her voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the professional confidence she typically projected. When we first started pushing you to sell the business, part of me was embarrassed. Embarrassed by what? By Thompson Manufacturing. By the fact that my mother ran a blue-collar manufacturing company in small-town Ohio while I was working for prestigious firms in Chicago. She paused, clearly struggling with the admission. I thought your business was beneath what our family should aspire to. The honesty was painful but necessary. And now I realize I was an idiot. What you've built here is more impressive than anything I've achieved in marketing. You've created sustainable employment for 150 families, contributed to your community's economic stability, and maintained profitability in an industry that everyone said was dying. She finally took a bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. I'm ashamed of how I talked about this place. Daniel nodded slowly. I was the same way. I kept thinking about how much money the property could generate through development, but I never considered what would be lost. The jobs, the community connection, the institutional knowledge that disappears when you shut down a business that's been operating for 4 decades. Ryan's contribution was characteristically analytical but more personal than his usual assessment. I was so focused on the financial metrics that I forgot businesses are made up of people. When I calculated labor costs, I was thinking about numbers on a spreadsheet, not Maria's nursing school tuition or Tom's mortgage payment. These admissions represented a fundamental shift in how my children saw not just Thompson Manufacturing, but the work Helen and I had devoted our lives to building. For the first time, they understood that their mother's business wasn't a failure to be cleaned up but an achievement to be respected. I appreciate your honesty, I said, but recognition is just the first step. The question is what you want to do with that recognition. Daniel straightened in his chair and I could see him transitioning into problem-solving mode. What would be most helpful? I know my real estate development experience isn't directly applicable, but maybe there are ways I could contribute. The question opened up possibilities I'd been hoping for but hadn't dared to expect. Actually, Daniel, your development experience could be incredibly valuable. We're considering expanding our facilities, but we need someone who understands zoning regulations, construction management, and permit processes. His eyes lit up with genuine interest. You're thinking about expansion. How big? Big enough to handle the new contracts we're pursuing. Johnson Industries wants to double their orders, and we've got 3 other companies interested in our specialized components. But we'd need additional production space and probably another 30 employees. I could help with that, Daniel said, his voice carrying enthusiasm I hadn't heard when he'd been discussing demolition plans, site planning, contractor selection, project management. It would be completely different from my usual work, but the skills Becca had been listening intently, and now she leaned forward with the focused attention she brought to challenging projects. Mom, what about marketing? I know you've built strong relationships with existing clients, but if you're expanding production capacity, you might need help reaching new markets. Actually, that's something we've been discussing with the worker committee. Tom Wilson thinks we could be doing more with online presence and trade show participation. We have excellent products and competitive pricing, but our marketing has always been pretty basic. I could help with that too, Becca said, her marketing expertise finally finding a constructive outlet. B2B marketing is different from what I usually do, but manufacturing companies often have tremendous growth potential that's limited by outdated marketing approaches. Ryan had been quietly taking notes throughout this discussion, and now he looked up with something approaching excitement. Mom, if Daniel's helping with expansion and Becca's working on marketing, there might be a role for financial planning too. Not telling you what to do, he added quickly, but helping optimize cash flow during growth phases, employee benefit programs, maybe retirement planning for long-term workers. The conversation was taking on a momentum I hadn't anticipated. My children weren't just apologizing for their past behavior, they were actively looking for ways to contribute their skills to Thompson Manufacturing's future. The shift from critics to collaborators was happening faster than I dared to hope. There's something else you should know, I said, pulling out the folder I'd been saving for this moment. The employee ownership structure includes provisions for family members to participate, but only if they're willing to work within the cooperative model. I spread out the documents detailing how the ownership system worked. Every employee, from assembly line workers to management, owned shares based on their years of service and contribution to company success. Profits were distributed quarterly, with bonuses tied to productivity and quality metrics. Most importantly, major decisions were made by elected committees that included representatives from every department. This is fascinating, Ryan said, studying the financial structure. It's like a worker cooperative model, but with professional management and family involvement. Exactly. Helen actually researched cooperative businesses extensively before she died. She was convinced that employee ownership was the future of manufacturing, especially for companies that depend on skilled workers and community relationships. Daniel was examining the expansion plans with the trained eye of someone who'd managed dozens of construction projects. These drawings are detailed. You've really thought through the logistics. Tom Wilson and Maria Santos worked with an architectural firm to design the addition. They understand workflow patterns and efficiency requirements better than any outside consultant could. Becca had moved to the whiteboard where James had earlier outlined our financial transformation. Now she was sketching out marketing concepts, her years of experience translating into ideas specifically tailored to manufacturing. Mom, I'm seeing huge opportunities here. Manufacturing companies that emphasize employee ownership and community connection have tremendous authenticity advantages in today's market. Customers want to do business with companies that have strong values. That's actually part of our long-term strategy, I said. We're not just selling products, we're selling the story of what businesses can become when they prioritize people alongside profits. The energy in the room had completely transformed. Where we'd started with confrontation and defensiveness, we now had collaboration and genuine excitement. My children were seeing Thompson Manufacturing not as an embarrassment to be eliminated, but as an opportunity to be part of something meaningful. Ryan closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. Mom, I have to ask something. If we get involved, how do we make sure we don't fall back into the same patterns? How do we avoid treating you like someone who needs our management instead of someone whose leadership we're supporting? The question showed a level of self-awareness that gave me hope for our future working relationship. That's exactly why the cooperative structure is so important. No one person, including me, has unilateral authority. Every major decision goes through committees that include worker representatives. So if I want to implement new financial systems, Ryan said, I'd have to convince the finance committee, which includes people who actually handle day-to-day money management. And if I want to launch new marketing initiatives, Becca added, I'd need buy-in from the workers who interact with customers and understand our product. And if I want to modify expansion plans, Daniel concluded, I'd be working with the people who actually use the facilities and know what improvements would make the biggest difference. Exactly. Helen designed this system specifically to prevent any individual from overriding collective wisdom, even me. James Parker returned as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the factory floor that was now transitioning from day shift to evening shift. The continuity of production, the steady hum of people doing meaningful work, provided a backdrop to our family's own transition. Margaret, I hate to interrupt, but the evening supervisors wanted to know if you'd be staying late tonight. They're excited about tomorrow's Johnson Industries visit and wanted to coordinate timing. Actually, James, I think we're about ready to wrap up for today. I looked around the conference room table at my children, these successful adults who'd finally started to see their mother as a resource rather than a responsibility. But I expect we'll be having a lot more meetings like this in the coming week. Daniel was gathering up his unused sales documents, the papers that had been meant to formalize my surrender but now seemed like artifacts from a different era. Mom, before we go, I need to say something. I came here today expecting to close a business deal. Instead, I feel like I'm starting a family partnership. Becca nodded in agreement. I spent 2 months researching retirement communities for you, thinking about where you'd be comfortable and safe. Now I'm thinking about how to market products made by worker owners in small-town Ohio. Ryan was saving files on his laptop, but these were notes about cooperative finance models rather than liquidation strategies. I calculated how much money you could make from selling this place. Now I'm calculating how much value we could create by growing it. As we prepared to leave the building that had been the center of so much conflict and was now becoming the foundation for a new kind of family relationship, I realized that Helen's greatest gift hadn't been the money. It had been the opportunity to prove that written off doesn't mean worthless, that dismissed doesn't mean defeated, and that families can find their way back to each other when they start treating each other with the respect they show to strangers. The parking lot conversation that followed was unlike any we'd had in years. Instead of rushing away to their separate successful lives, my children lingered, discussing logistics for the expansion project, marketing strategies for new client development, and financial models for sustainable growth. Mom, Daniel said as he finally opened his car door, I know this is premature, but I'm thinking about relocating some of my operations to Riverside. If we're going to be working together, I'd rather be here than commuting from Columbus. Becca was making notes on her phone, probably already developing marketing campaigns in her head. I could work remotely from here at least part-time. Chicago's not that far, and honestly, I think I've been missing small-town life more than I realized. Ryan's contribution was practical but heartfelt. I'd like to set up a financial planning service for Thompson Manufacturing employees, not just retirement accounts, but comprehensive financial wellness programs. If they're going to be owners, they should understand wealth building. Watching my children drive away that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the future, not relief that a crisis had been resolved, but genuine anticipation for what we could build together. The factory was quiet now except for security lighting and the distant sound of the evening cleaning crew. I walked through the empty production areas, past the new equipment that hummed efficiently even when idle, past the employee bulletin board covered with photos and announcements from people who took pride in their work. In my pocket, my phone buzzed with a text message from Maria Santos. Miss Thompson, heard the meeting went well today. The whole crew is excited about working with your kids. See you tomorrow. Similar messages arrived from Tom Wilson, Carlos Rodriguez, and half a dozen other employees who'd been watching our family drama unfold and hoping for a positive resolution. These people had invested their faith in my ability to find a path forward, and now they were welcoming my children into a partnership that could benefit everyone. As I locked up the building and headed home to my modest apartment, I realized that this space no longer felt like exile. It felt like a launching pad for the next phase of my life, a phase where being a mouth to feed had transformed into being the person who fed others exactly what they needed to grow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that families and businesses could thrive when everyone contributed their strengths, instead of competing for control. My children had learned that their mother was still capable of surprising them. Now it was time to see what surprises we could create together. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened faster than I'd expected. Within 2 weeks of our confrontation in the conference room, Daniel had relocated his project management office to a renovated space above Mike's place, 3 blocks from Thompson Manufacturing. Becca had negotiated a remote work arrangement with her Chicago firm that allowed her to spend 4 days a week in Riverside. Ryan had given notice at his financial advisory company and was in the process of establishing his own practice focused on worker-owned business. The speed of their commitment surprised everyone, including me. I'd expected gradual involvement, perhaps occasional visits to check on progress. Instead, I found myself working alongside children who seemed determined to prove they could contribute as much energy to building something as they'd previously devoted to tearing it down. Daniel's first project was typical of his thoroughness. Rather than jumping into expansion plans, he spent 3 weeks walking through every square foot of Thompson Manufacturing with Tom Wilson, asking questions about workflow, efficiency bottlenecks, and safety concerns. I watched from my office window as my son, dressed in work boots and a hard hat instead of his usual expensive suits, crawled under machinery and climbed onto loading docks to understand how our operation actually functioned. "Your boy's got good instincts," Tom told me one afternoon, as we observed Daniel measuring clearances around our largest CNC machine. "He doesn't assume he knows better than the people doing the work, asks smart questions, and actually listens to the answer." The contrast with Daniel's previous attitude was striking. Where he'd once seen outdated equipment and inefficient processes, he now saw opportunities for strategic improvements that could enhance rather than replace our existing capability. His expansion proposal, when it finally came, reflected deep understanding of our operational needs. "Mom, I've been working with the production team, and we think the smart approach is modular expansion," he explained during a presentation to the worker committee. "Instead of one massive addition, we build smaller, specialized spaces that can be configured based on contract requirements." Maria Santos, who'd initially been skeptical of any Thompson family member offering suggestions, nodded approvingly. "That makes sense. Sometimes we need more assembly space, sometimes more precision machining capacity. Flexible is better than just bigger." Becca's integration into our operations was equally thoughtful but completely different in approach. She started by interviewing every employee about their perspective on Thompson Manufacturing's reputation and customer relationships. What she discovered challenged assumptions I'd held for decades. "Mom, you've been thinking about this business as primarily local and regional, but your products have incredible potential for national markets," she told me after completing her employee interview. "Carlos mentioned that 3 different customers have asked if we could supply other product lines. Maria says clients regularly comment on our quality and reliability compared to offshore suppliers." The marketing strategy Becca developed was unlike anything Thompson Manufacturing had ever attempted. Instead of traditional trade advertising, she proposed what she called authentic storytelling that highlighted our employee ownership model and community connection. "Manufacturing companies often seem faceless and corporate," she explained to a packed employee meeting, "but Thompson Manufacturing has genuine advantages because customers can actually meet the people who make their products and understand the values that drive our work." Her first initiative was a customer visit program where potential clients could tour our facilities, meet our worker owners, and see firsthand the craftsmanship and care that went into every product. The response exceeded all expectations. "Thompson, this is brilliant," said Jennifer Walsh, purchasing manager for Johnson Industries during her second visit to our facility. "My company talks about partnering with suppliers who share our values, but this is the first time I've actually met the people who make what we buy." Ryan's contribution was perhaps the most complex because it involved changing how our worker owners thought about money, ownership, and long-term financial planning. His first challenge was overcoming suspicion from employees who'd heard plenty of financial advice over the years, most of it designed to benefit advisors more than clients. I know some of you are wondering why the boss's son is suddenly interested in your retirement planning, he said during his introductory presentation to the workforce. The honest answer is that employee ownership only works if employees understand how to build wealth through ownership. He started by offering free financial literacy workshops during lunch breaks, covering everything from basic budgeting to investment strategies specifically relevant to worker-owned business. The sessions were voluntary, but attendance grew each week as employees realized Ryan was teaching practical skills rather than selling products. Ryan explained how our profit sharing works better than anything I've read in the employee manual, said Janet Foster, who worked in our shipping department. I never understood how my daily work connected to the quarterly bonuses until he showed us the number. The cultural shift within Thompson Manufacturing was profound but gradual. Employees who'd grown accustomed to being told what to do found themselves being asked for input on major decisions. The elected committees that Helen's ownership structure had created became forums for genuine collaboration rather than mere consultation. It's weird having the boss's kids ask for our opinions, admitted Frank Martinez, one of our veteran machinists, but they're not pretending to listen. They actually change plans based on what we tell them. The 3-month mark brought our first major test of the new family dynamics. Johnson Industries offered us a contract that would triple our revenue but require significant operational changes and tight delivery schedule. The old Thompson Manufacturing would have either accepted the contract and stressed our workforce to the breaking point, or declined it and missed a major growth opportunity. The new Thompson Manufacturing approached the decision differently. Daniel analyzed the infrastructure requirements and determined we could handle the volume with targeted equipment additions and workflow modifications. Becca researched Johnson Industries' long-term needs and discovered they were looking for a primary supplier relationship that could last decades. Ryan calculated the financial impact and concluded the contract would provide stable income for worker owners while funding continued expansion. But the final decision belonged to the Workforce Committee, which spent 2 weeks evaluating how the contract would affect working conditions, job security, and company culture. "We can do this," announced Patricia Reeves, the committee chairwoman and a 15-year veteran of our quality control department. "But we want guarantees about hiring additional workers rather than just increasing hours for existing employees. And we want Johnson Industries to commit to multi-year volume projections so we can plan our lives." The negotiation process that followed demonstrated how much our family relationships had changed. Instead of me making unilateral decisions while my children criticized from the sidelines, we worked as a team to structure a deal that met everyone's needs. Daniel handled the operational logistics, working with Johnson Industries' engineering team to design workflows that could scale efficiently. Becca managed communications, ensuring that all stakeholders understood not just what we were promising but why we could deliver. Ryan structured the financial terms to provide stable cash flow while protecting Thompson Manufacturing from overdependence on a single client. When we signed the Johnson Industries contract, the celebration at Thompson Manufacturing included not just our employees, but their families and much of downtown Riverside. Mike's Place hosted an impromptu party where 3 generations of Thompson workers shared stories about the company's evolution. "I started here when your parents ran this place," said Robert Chen, our most senior employee, as he raised his beer in a toast. "Thought it was over when times got tough. Never imagined it would turn into something better than what we started with." The success with Johnson Industries led to opportunities we'd never considered. Word spread through manufacturing networks about Thompson Manufacturing's unique ownership structure and customer-focused approach. Within 6 months, we had inquiries from companies across the Midwest interested in our products and our business model. "Mom, we might have accidentally started a movement," Becca said during one of our weekly family meetings. "I'm getting calls from other worker-owned businesses wanting to learn about our marketing approaches. There's definitely demand for what we're selling beyond just our product." This observation led to Thompson Manufacturing's most ambitious expansion, a consulting division that helped other small manufacturers transition to employee ownership model. Ryan took the lead on this initiative, combining his financial expertise with lessons learned from our own transformation. "The numbers are compelling," he explained to a group of business owners visiting from Toledo. "Employee-owned companies typically show higher productivity, lower turnover, and stronger customer loyalty. But the transition requires careful planning and genuine commitment to shared decision-making. Daniel's contribution to the consulting division was developing standardized processes for facility improvements and workflow optimization that could be adapted to different manufacturing environments. His real estate background proved invaluable for companies that needed to restructure their physical operations, alongside their ownership models. Becca created marketing materials and communication strategies that helped other businesses tell their transformation stories effectively. Her work attracted attention from business schools and economic development organizations interested in promoting worker ownership as a tool for community revitalization. The consulting work brought unexpected benefits to Thompson Manufacturing beyond additional revenue. Studying other companies' challenges and successes gave us insights that improved our own operations. More importantly, it positioned us as leaders in a growing movement toward more equitable and sustainable business models. It's ironic, I told Patricia Hoffman during one of our regular check-in calls. My children wanted to get rid of a struggling small business. Now they're helping create an industry around democratic workplace ownership. Dr. Hoffman's response reflected her understanding of family dynamics and organizational psychology. Margaret, they're not just helping other businesses, they're proving to themselves and to you that they can be builders instead of just critics. That's enormously important for long-term family relationships. The personal relationships within our family continued evolving alongside the business success. Daniel had rented a house in Riverside and was dating Linda Chen, Robert's daughter, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. His lifestyle had shifted from expensive restaurants and exclusive clubs to community events and Saturday morning coffee at Mike's Place. I forgot what it felt like to know my neighbors, he told me one evening as we walked through downtown Riverside after a town council meeting where Thompson Manufacturing had been recognized for our contributions to local economic development. Columbus was successful for me professionally, but I was isolated personally. Becca's integration into Riverside life was more gradual but equally significant. She joined the school board and was working with teachers to develop programs that connected classroom learning with real-world manufacturing skills. Her Chicago apartment sat mostly empty while she spent increasing amounts of time in the modest house she'd bought near the river. I'm realizing that career advancement and life satisfaction aren't always the same thing, she confided during one of our weekly dinners. Working with Thompson Manufacturing gives me more purpose than any corporate campaign I managed in Chicago. Ryan had perhaps changed the most dramatically. His previous focus on maximizing individual wealth had evolved into expertise in building collective prosperity. His financial planning practice attracted clients from across Ohio who were interested in cooperative business models and community-focused investing. Mom, I used to measure success by how much money I could accumulate personally, he said as we reviewed Thompson Manufacturing's quarterly profit-sharing distributions. Now I measure it by how much wealth we can create for everyone involved in our work. The first anniversary of Helen's death brought our family together for a memorial service that celebrated not just her life, but the transformation her legacy had made possible. Standing in the Thompson Manufacturing parking lot where she'd spent countless hours loading products and solving problems, I spoke to an audience that included our workers, their families, and representatives from the dozen other businesses we'd helped transition to employee ownership. Helen Rodriguez believed that work could be more than just a paycheck, that businesses could serve communities instead of extracting from them, and that regular people could build extraordinary things when given the chance. I said, the best way to honor her memory is to keep building on the foundation she helped us create. After the memorial, my children and I walked through the facility that had been the source of so much conflict and had become the foundation for our renewed relationship. The expansion was nearly complete, with new equipment arriving weekly and job applications coming in from across the region. Mom, can I ask you something I've been wondering about? Daniel said as we stood in the original production area where Robert and I had started Thompson Manufacturing 43 years earlier. Of course. Do you ever regret not just telling us about Helen's inheritance from the beginning? We could have avoided months of tension and misunderstanding. I considered his question while watching Maria Santos train 2 new employees on our updated assembly procedure. These young people would learn their jobs in an environment where their opinions mattered, where they'd own a share of what they built, and where their economic security was connected to their commitment to quality work. Daniel, if I'd simply announced that Helen had left me money, what would have happened? We probably would have tried to talk you into safer investments than saving a struggling business. And then, we'd have missed everything that came after. The employee ownership, the consulting business, the community impact, the family relationships we've built. Exactly. Sometimes the hardest path leads to the most valuable destinations. Becca had been listening to our conversation while reviewing expansion blueprints with Tom Wilson. Now she looked up with the satisfied expression of someone who'd found her professional calling in an unexpected place. Mom, I think you knew we needed to earn our way back into this family business rather than just being given access to it. Ryan nodded in agreement. If you'd handed us money and ownership without requiring us to understand what we'd been wrong about, we would have repeated the same mistakes. Perhaps, I said, but I also think you needed to discover for yourselves that building something meaningful is more satisfying than just accumulating wealth or advancing career. As we prepared to leave the factory that evening, I realized that Thompson Manufacturing had become something none of us had originally envisioned. It was no longer just a family business or even just a worker-owned cooperative. It had become a model for how families could transform conflict into collaboration, how businesses could serve communities while remaining profitable, and how people who'd been written off could write their own futures. The evening cleaning crew was arriving for their shift, and I waved to Paula Martinez, Frank's wife, who supervised the team. She'd been hired 6 months earlier when we'd decided to bring janitorial services in-house rather than contracting them out. Like every Thompson Manufacturing employee, she owned shares in the company and participated in quarterly profit distributions. "See you tomorrow, Mrs. Thompson," she called out. "Can't wait to see how the new assembly line looks when it's finished." Driving home to my apartment, which no longer felt like exile but like a comfortable base for the next phase of my life, I thought about how much had changed since that devastating March morning when Ryan had called me just another mouth to feed. The words that had been intended to diminish me had instead triggered a transformation that empowered not just me, but everyone whose life was connected to Thompson Manufacturing. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Hoff. "Margaret, saw the article about Thompson Manufacturing in the Business Journal. How does it feel to be featured as an innovative leader in worker ownership?" I smiled as I typed my response. It feels like the beginning rather than the end of the story. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. A delegation from the State Economic Development Office was visiting to discuss using Thompson Manufacturing as a model for rural business revitalization. 3 more companies had scheduled consultations about transitioning to employee ownership. Most importantly, my children would continue learning that their greatest legacy wouldn't be what they accumulated individually but what they built together with others. The transformation was complete, but the work was just beginning. And for the first time in years I was excited about what came next. 5 years later I stood at the podium of the National Conference on Worker Ownership, looking out at an audience of business leaders, economists and policymakers who'd come to hear about what had become known as the Thompson model. The conference was being held in Columbus, just an hour from Riverside, but the ideas we'd developed in our small Ohio factory were now being discussed in boardrooms and classrooms across the country. When my son told me I was just another mouth to feed, I began drawing chuckles from the audience. I decided to feed him something he'd never forget. What I didn't expect was that our family crisis would spark a movement that's now helping hundreds of businesses transition to democratic ownership. In the front row sat Daniel, Becca, and Ryan along with their spouses and children. My grandchildren had grown up understanding that businesses could be owned by the people who worked in them, that success was measured by community impact as well as profit, and that families could overcome their worst conflicts by learning to respect each other's contribution. Thompson Manufacturing now employed over 400 people across 3 facilities in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. Our consulting division had helped 127 companies transition to employee ownership, creating democratic workplaces for more than 8,000 workers. The ripple effects extended far beyond business metrics into stronger communities, more engaged workers, and families who'd learned to bridge generational and class differences. The secret wasn't the money my business partner left me, I continued The secret was refusing to accept other people's definitions of my worth and capabilities. When you've been written off, you have two choices: accept the assessment, or prove it wrong. I chose to prove it wrong in the most dramatic way possible. The Q&A session that followed focused on practical implementation strategies, but the questions that mattered most to me came from younger audience members who were dealing with their own family and workplace challenges. A woman about Becca's age asked how to convince her parents that their traditional business could benefit from worker input. A man Ryan's age wanted advice on transitioning from individual financial success to collective wealth building. Change starts with listening, I told them. Really listening, not just waiting for your turn to speak. The people closest to the work usually know the most about how to improve it. The people you're trying to help usually know more about their own needs than you do. After the conference, our extended family gathered for dinner at a restaurant in downtown Columbus. The table included not just my children and their families, but Tom Wilson and his wife Maria Santos and her husband, and Patricia Hoffman, who'd become both professional advisor and personal friend over the years. "Grandma Maggie," said Emma, Daniel's 8-year-old daughter, "tell the story about when you surprised Daddy and Aunt Becca and Uncle Ryan." The story had become family legend, told and retold at holiday gatherings and milestone celebrations. But as I looked around the table at faces that reflected genuine affection rather than obligation, I realized the real story wasn't about surprising my children. It was about discovering that transformation is possible at any age, when you're willing to demand better from yourself and others. The best part of the story, I told Emma, is that it's still being written. Every day your father helps another company create better jobs for working families. Every day your Aunt Becca shows people that businesses can have strong values and strong profits. Every day your Uncle Ryan helps families build wealth together instead of just competing against each other. Dr. Hoffman raised her glass for a toast to Margaret Thompson, who proved that being underestimated can be the greatest strategic advantage, and to the Thompson family, who showed that even the deepest conflicts can become the foundation for stronger relationships. As we clinked glasses, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. The pain of being dismissed by my own children had been real and lasting, but that pain had also been transformative, forcing me to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, and to demand respect I hadn't realized I deserved. The drive back to Riverside took us past the original Thompson Manufacturing building, now one of several facilities that bore our family name. The parking lot was full of cars belonging to the evening shift, workers who owned shares in the company and had voices in its management. Security lights illuminated the sign that had been installed on the building's anniversary, Thompson Manufacturing, owned by the people who build it. "Mom," Ryan said as we pulled into my driveway, "I need to tell you something I've been thinking about." "What's that?" I used to measure my success by how much money I could make and how high I could climb in my career. Now I measure it by how many families have better lives because of work we've done together. Becca nodded from the front seat. "I spent years trying to escape everything I thought was ordinary about small-town life. Now I understand that building something meaningful in your own community is more valuable than achieving recognition in someone else's." Daniel turned off the engine, but made no move to get out of the car. "Mom, what you did 5 years ago saved more than just Thompson Manufacturing. You saved our family. You showed us who we could become if we stopped focusing on what we could get and started focusing on what we could give." Standing in front of my apartment building, which I'd chosen to keep even though I could now afford much grander accommodations, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. The woman who'd been told she was just another mouth to feed had become someone who fed others opportunities, dignity, and hope. My phone buzzed with a text message from Helen's nephew, who managed her foundation's grants to worker-owned businesses. "Aunt Margaret, the foundation board approved funding for 12 more cooperative transitions this quarter. Helen would be so proud of what you've built." As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I smiled thinking about Helen and how she'd known exactly what I'd needed to hear in her letter. Not instructions for revenge, but encouragement to reclaim my power. Not a plan for punishment, but resources for transformation. The apartment was quiet, except for the distant sounds of riverside settling into evening routine. Families finishing dinner, students doing homework, workers returning from late shifts at businesses throughout the city. In my small way, I'd helped create economic opportunities that kept young people from having to leave town for decent jobs, that provided older workers with dignity and security, and that showed everyone that alternatives to traditional employment were possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. A documentary crew was coming to film the Thompson Manufacturing story for a series about innovative businesses. 2 more companies had requested consultations about employee ownership transition. Most importantly, Emma and her cousins would visit after school to help with the community garden we'd planted behind the factory, learning that businesses could contribute to their neighborhoods in ways that went beyond just providing jobs. The bankruptcy papers my children had expected to feed me 5 years ago sat framed on my desk, not as a trophy of victory but as a reminder that crisis often precedes transformation. Above them hung a photo from last month's employee appreciation dinner, showing workers and their families celebrating another year of shared success. As I prepared for bed, I thought about all the people who'd told me what I couldn't do, what I shouldn't try, what I was too old or too inexperienced to achieve. Their assessments had been wrong, but more importantly, I'd stopped allowing other people's limitations to define my possibility. The transformation that had begun with a cruel comment about being just another mouth to feed had created something none of us had imagined, a business model that valued human dignity alongside profit, a family that respected each other's contribution, and a community where ordinary people could build extraordinary things together. Sometimes the best revenge really is a life well lived, but even better than revenge is discovering that you have the power to create positive change that extends far beyond your own grievances. The woman who'd been written off had become someone who helped others write their own stories of transformation and success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.